Okay, we're back on What the Funk. I took a solid month off, family in town, holidays. It's hard to find a quiet place in the house. I have a pretty decent sized house, I would say, yet somehow when there's kids around, they just tend to find you and make the most noise right by you. Bet you guys can relate to that. So finally found a quiet place in my house. The kids are upstairs. Hopefully they stay upstairs for a little bit. You don't have basements, I think, where you live, right? I know in Houston they don't. I don't know about Dallas, Fort Worth.
No basements in my house.
The water level's too high in the ground, so yeah, no basements here.
Nice. But yeah, very, very excited. We've got Casey Patterson and Larry Brazile on this podcast. I think I said both your names right. I'm less concerned about Casey Patterson. It's a little bit more straightforward. Larry, did I get your name right?
Perfect. Thank you.
Awesome. Two of the guys over at Avenirre, I guess I would classify it as production-centric technology in oil and gas that might be underselling what you guys do, since it is kind of also a bit of data management, data aggregation, field data capture, dashboards, analytics, kind of across the board. Very, very much aligned with some of my history as well, both at Seven Lakes and with various other players. But really excited to have you both on. Appreciate your flexibility in doing this one around the holidays. So I'm just going to put the question out to you guys that I put out to everyone. Casey, you go first. Larry, you go second. Who are you guys? Who is Casey Patterson?
Oh, that's a pretty zany question to ask right off the bat, Jeremy. I'd say I'm just a guy who's a lifelong learner who saw an opportunity here with Avenirre. It's very. I have a science background and a desire to make things more efficient, and that's really who I am. Married, I have two boys that are just like feral bobcats most days. One's 8, one's 6 years old, and they encompass most of my life.
And I want to go back a little before we go over to Larry. I want to go back a little bit, Casey. So you were a football player. Now, granted, right. You're just sitting there in person. It's tough to tell. I've met people before that are like, I thought you were shorter than you are. I thought you were taller. I'm guessing you're probably bigger than you come across on camera, but you had big aspirations like a lot of you corn-fed Texas boys do about probably playing in the NFL. And I do believe that you played some football in college, and college for you was a bit of a different experience because you went to West Point. I've always been fascinated with the military. Some of my friends from high school ended up going to West Point, some of my neighbors actually as well. Had a few folks on this podcast who have been military folks. So talk a little bit about your experience. Why'd you decide to go to West Point? What was that experience like? Because, I'm like a traditional Northeast New England college kid, right? For me, liberal arts, wanted that kind of basic 4-year college education and experience. Always dabbled with the idea of maybe looking into the services, but what drew you to West Point, and talk a little bit about what it was like, and maybe even some of the discipline you learned there that carried into the rest of your life.
Oh, that's a really good question. My background going into West Point was really about a 45-minute phone call when I had no other options, and I got an appointment, got into the academy, went in as a 6'5", 200-pound tight end, and absolutely got crushed my first year and was determined to win. So, over the course of a year, I had a lot of academic probation, and which meant that I could rare the gym. Yeah. So, over the span of really 15 months, I gained over 100 pounds.
Wow.
And then just became more of a bulldozer. And at Army then, we ran the triple wish, or the conventional wishbone, I would say, that had some flexibility to it. So I kind of grew acclimated to the environment. And in that environment, what I realized is how inefficient we are as humans, with our time, with resources. And, my junior year at West Point, I was injured. The Army deemed me uncommissionable. I wound up at TCU, got a master's degree in geology, started working at XTO. And then all along, what carried with me is this concept of inefficiency. And now, as sitting here, and Larry and I, we have a passion for solving problems around inefficiency.
Nice. So you moved back home. How long did you go to West Point?
I was there almost 3 years, really 4.5 years in the Army, the way the out processing works. But I was there into my junior year when I got hurt. And then after 5 surgeries, the Army deemed me uncommissionable. I was damaged goods at that point. So my football career was over, and I moved back home to Fort Worth and started TCU after a couple of years.
Awesome. Larry, let's flip over to you. Who's Larry Brazile? Who is Larry Brazile?
Thank you, Jeremy. I thought I might just, as the seasoned more participant of the founder at Avenirre, I thought I might spend just a couple of minutes just going way back. My father fought in World War II in the Navy and was actually in Tokyo Bay when the war's end was signed. And that was in 1945. And he moved back to hometown, which is Paris, Texas. And this is the point I want to go. The reason I want to bring that up is that the hot industry of the time was telephones. As hard as that is to believe these days, the long distance phone call was not a very common thing. A lot of homes didn't have telephones at all. And so he came back and went to work for a company called Southwestern Bell, which became part of AT&T. And
Sure.
And my mother was a telephone operator for the same company. They met and life happens. They got married and they moved to Odessa, Texas, to put in telephones. And that's where I was born. And so I've lived all over Texas, but always Texas. I went to college at Texas A&M, got a degree in mechanical engineering. And as luck would have it, I graduated in December of 1974. And oil prices were high. And so I got 11 job offers, all of them from oil and gas companies. And so that started my career into this industry. And I've been forever thankful about that little stroke of luck that I had there. We went to work for Amoco Production Company. By the way, I should have said I'm married also. Have my wife and I, we consider ourselves newlyweds, even though we've been married 51 years. And so we have four children. All of them are married. All of them have children. We have 9 grandchildren. So we've got a nice, large family. Our holidays were probably just as loud as yours, if maybe not louder. But so after A&M, I went to work for Amoco Production Company in Houston as a reservoir engineer. And that started me down that path. And so through a few other companies along the way, I ended up in Fort Worth, Texas, working for EOG Resources as manager of reservoir engineering. And so after EOG, I had a reservoir engineering consulting firm. I met Casey, and then a friendship ensued. And we began to think about business opportunities together. And so that's how we got to Avenirre.
Well, long before that, Larry and my wife ran in I think it was the White Rock or the Dallas Marathon. It was like 24 degrees and rainy and sleety. And I thought, why are you doing this? And I said, who's going with you? And she said, well, there's a couple guys, a guy named Larry Brazile. And I thought, I'll stay right here at home. And I did. But yeah, and then Larry and I formally met probably 10 years ago or something like that. Right. We worked together. I worked for XTO for 10 years, and then I ran an upstream company, being private equity back, for another 8 after that. And that's how Larry and I met. Larry was a consulting reservoir engineer. He and I share, I think, this concept of efficiency. We look at production, we look at operations, and we look at each other and say, there's a better way of doing this. Yes. And that's what's forged our friendship now.
So this is interesting to me, and I do want to pivot a little bit to Avenirre. I don't want to get too far away from the personal stuff, because I can tell we could easily dive into family and football and phones and what all of formations, funkiness, anything that begins with an F or a PH, right? We can make it work. But interesting to me that you guys, your background, XTO and EOG, two of the best and 2 of the biggest operators. And if you look at Avenirre, and your website, it's a lot of smaller operators, right? So interesting to me. You want to talk a little bit about that? Like, I'm sure what you learned about the large machine-like oil and gas companies that you worked at for a long time, and maybe some of the efficiencies or inefficiencies and then trying to bring some efficiencies to smaller operators. Has that been like a conscious focus that you guys have had? And where did that idea come from?
Well, for me, it has. XTO was a world class place that gave me a world class opportunity, and I learned tremendously while I was there. And what I saw was that there were a few people that worked there. Not everybody, but a few people could see the problems very quickly, and they could work through the workflow in their head very rapidly to make a decision on whether something made sense to do or not. Not everybody has that skill set. So part of what Avenirre is doing is automating the process that these fantastic engineers like Larry, where you can quickly look at something and see what's going on, whether it's problem identification or in economic awareness. So I would say yes. I mean, and I've even told my old XTO cohorts that is I'm trying to really automate. At least personally, I'm trying to automate what I didn't even know at the time at XTO that these wonderful engineers, these great engineers could see.
And I would add
Nice.
to that, when a company just becomes really, really large, they tend to have their own IT departments, and they tend to develop some of the things in-house. And so essentially one of the ways you think about Avenirre is we're functioning as an IT department for the smaller operators that can't afford to do this themselves, but they can afford to have us help them with their problems.
Yeah, one of the negatives of the shell place too is it really exacerbated this silo problem where people were stuck in one kind of part of engineering or geology or whatever they're in, and there really was no kind of global versatility. So we're automating a lot of that, and it's hard to believe, but 20 years ago, having real time visibility into what's going on was pretty advanced. Well, now today we have things on our phones. We have dishwashers. We have sprinkler systems that give us much greater technology than even what oil and gas companies have.
Yeah, the silo thing is really something, and I think it's gotten a little bit better. Part of that could be because there's more remote resources that were traditionally in the back office and all working together. But for me, coming from the software space, it was actually kind of jarring when I got into oil and gas to see, my first job was selling software to accounting, land, and production. And to see accounting make a decision, and I'd be like, all right, cool. So is land going to go with this too? They're like, oh, you're going to need to talk to them. I'm like, well, you're making like a big expensive decision on your accounting software. Do they know that you're going with this product? And they said, I don't know.
That's so true.
Whoa, you don't talk to them? Because, from the software side, it's like, there's somebody has an idea, and then the developers work on the idea, and you see the testers kind of working through their, whether it be agile or waterfall through their sprints. And then they're keeping sales in the loop. And then when the product release is ready, sales goes out and sells it, gets market feedback, and it gets handed over to, customer support, or what people call now customer success. So I didn't experience working in silos coming from that side. And then to sell software to companies that were in very, very distinct siloed areas, despite, for example, production accounting. I just sort of assumed, all right, well, cool. Somebody in accounting will make this decision. They go, no, you got to talk to production accounting.
Right.
What do you mean? Isn't that just accounting? They're like, no. We don't do allocations on our side. We're JIP, we're revenue, we're GL, right? We're not production accounting. Oh, okay, cool. And I think that part of it could have been generational, right? Part of it could have been focus. Like, we just want you to focus on the job that we've assigned to you to do. Part of it's also just freaking crazy. And I do think that the breaking down the silos in terms of what you guys do is important. Like, how do you do that? First, functionally, technically, but also more importantly, culturally. Because I think that is important for you guys to break through if you're going to do business in the oil and gas industry. How do you bring these groups together?
Boy, that's another a really good question. It's and let me back up just for a little bit. When Larry and I, when we started contemplating something around Avenirre, There were a lot of problems that our industry had. It could be the expense of software. It could be silos. We identified probably a dozen things, Jeremy. And then leading up to COVID was the catalyst for a need for a new solution. I mean, we started working remotely now, which exacerbated this problem of silos. I mean, you would have people working from one office to another in a corporate space that didn't know exactly what they were doing. And I saw that a lot. And so there needed to be something, even culturally, when we looked at the way we used to work, and it got maybe a little worse, even though technology got a little bit better. I think communication got a little bit worse. At the same time, you're having commodity prices that are either flat to backwardated, and you've got some seasonal uplift. Service costs, people costs are all going up at the same time. So that free cash flow margin, or that operating cash flow margin for companies, is just shrinking and shrinking. So there had to be a new solution on doing it better. So one of the problems is how do we expand the knowledge base, right? And one is we said, look, we're not going to have software that sits on somebody's desktop. It's going to be entirely accessible via the web. Which means that if you want to go to Thailand, and if you got a browser and internet access, you can see all of your production data. Secondly, I would say is we need to really get to the heart of why every oil and gas company is here. It's not just production management. It's not expense management. It's really cash flow management. So the end solution that you need to get to every user really is around cash flow management. So and it has to be, so long as a user has the rights to see it, it needs to be accessible, anywhere in the world, because that's the way we work now.
Jeremy, I'd like to add there that Casey did a really good job there of explaining kind of the philosophy things, but from a different perspective, though, the silos were created because there was individually different softwares that uses their own databases to record certain information. And so what Avenirre did, just as a forcing function, we're just going to have one database, and everything's got to go to one. That way it's instantly accessible by anybody in the company who has rights and permissions to see it. And so it's all in SQL. It's all ready to go for everybody. So.
Now, we'll talk a little bit more about the technology itself, but I want to get to the who. Who accesses Avenirre? Who uses your product? Is it lease operators in the field? Is it production foremans? Is it the CEO, COO, CFO? Or is it yes to all of them? Like, who are the people that are using and getting the most value out of the Avenirre product?
Yeah, it's everybody you just described. It's everybody from the field personnel who are loading production data daily, all the way up to C-suite. CFO looks at it and looks at the historical expense data and how it tracks. He might look at cash flow for borrowing-based purposes for some borrowing covenant. COO is certainly looking at it to make economic decisions about where to go, comparing which one of their programs are most economic, whether it's in a payout or cost per barrel to add. And one of the things that makes us unique is we understand those problems. So we help our customers navigate through that. We are constantly developing new solutions based on problems that are old and problems that are new. To answer your question is it's really everybody that touches production. Since production is revenue and revenue is what supports a company. We don't do geology. We don't do drilling. We don't do completions. Larry and I just figured out that cash flow management is a challenging enough concept that's where we want to focus.
Yep. Yeah. And Larry, I'm sure you may have more to chime in on this, but I think downturns really increase the importance of your existing production, right? Because if you're not able to get the borrowing base or spend money to do your 16 wells that you were planning on drilling this year or this quarter or this month, depending on the size of your company, well, then you better optimize your existing production because it's already flowing, right? So I learned this big time. I came into the industry in 2007. And my first day on the job, I want to say oil was $138 a barrel and natural gas was about $14 an MCF. And yeah, there was like a quick dip down to like the high 30s or low 40s maybe a year later. But then it shot back up, and oil prices generally stayed between about $80 and $100 a barrel till around Thanksgiving of 2014. So it was still it was a really good time to sell technology, and I think also to be an operator, because there was just a lot of room for error. There was a lot of margin available. And then we hit a pretty significant downturn in 2016, especially when oil got down to $26 a barrel. Natural gas has been a little bit lower for a while now. But what I noticed is the focus on cash flow, as well as efficiency, especially related to field productivity around existing production, became even more important. And that didn't go away. If anything, we've seen more and more companies with a focus on production optimization, efficiency, and cash flow management. Free cash flow is a term that you hear a lot of. So I think that we're kind of in an era where there's likely never going to be the same level of money available for new drillers. It's just not there. We used to see companies forming right and left all the time. You don't now. So companies do have to optimize and become extremely efficient in their production. What are some of the things that you feel like Avenirre does that tie directly to that bottom line? Is it making recommendations on how to optimize a certain asset, field, or individual well? Is it making recommendations around artificial lift type, injection chemical material? Is it focus on LOE and some of the efficiencies that might not be happening on a route by route basis? Like, what are some of the things, to get to the nuts and bolts of it, that you guys do to create more free cash flow and optimize production?
Good question, Jeremy. I'd say the first thing that comes to mind when I heard your question was one of the things that is so important is under a word that doesn't sound very important, but it's we bring visibility to a company. So if you can easily, without a whole lot of effort, look at each individual well, each individual property, all the properties by groups, however you need to slice it and dice it to get down to the answer. And if you can capture the data so that a operating loss cannot hide from you anymore, then you will have your best chance at optimizing your cash flow. And let me tell you, that's more prevalent than you would think, because a lot of really large companies, even large companies, say in the Permian Basin, that have units, if they capture their production and their revenue at the unit level and not take that production and expenses all the way down to the individual well level, what you can invariably have is wells that are losing money, but they're kind of hidden. They're kind of invisible. And so we make the invisible visible, so that then you can actually run your business using real data and actually get to the problems that need to be solved.
Is that like your company tagline?
Well, it seems to be, doesn't it? I'll say one other thing, though, that you kind of triggered a thought in my mind, is that if you back off and look at a bigger picture, a longer time frame of the oil field, the commodity pricings just go through cycles. They just fluctuate. They're up and down. And the companies that really survive over the long term, one of the things they are is low-cost operators. And the ability to be efficient at your operations, manage your expenses, and really make good decisions on the little things, in the world, like, how quickly do you locate a well that's off production so that you minimize your downtime? All those little things that all of a sudden kind of add up to make you an efficient operator. So then when times are not so good, you survive. And when times are good, then you do really well.
Yeah. How do you reduce your lifting costs to a point of making it sustainable? Because I do remember a point during COVID, a Wall Street Journal or New York Times article, something like that said there are only 4 or 5 companies that can survive for a long period of time at their lifting costs in the 20s, right? And there was Crown Quest was one of them. I think Diamondback would have been one of them. And some of them were just blessed with great acreage and great rock. But at the same time, there was a focus on efficiency to reduce that lifting cost and make themselves as efficient as possible. But what you're referring to is it's math, and basically it's it's the margins. Like, I'm a diehard Boston Celtics fan, and there's been a little bit of backlash. NBA champions, shout out Boston Celtics, 18-time champs. They shoot a lot of 3-pointers, and it's sheer math, right? They really bludgeon people with math. Now, when they lose, it doesn't look good because they miss a lot of shots, but they win a lot because, simply put, if you can shoot 40% and shoot 53 pointers a game, you're making 23 pointers a game. You put the other team in a position where they have to then start to adjust the way that they play to keep up with you, and then they're trying to beat you at your own math. And maybe that's not how other teams are designed to play. It's frustrating, I think, even for some fans of the team, and certainly for fans that play against them, that it's just 3-pointer, 3-pointer, 3-pointer. But if you look at the margins, they're trying to win on the margins. Whereas if their total potential output of possible points is 180 if they make all their shots versus 155 because they take less 3-pointers, it's just math, right? So, I mean, similar concepts apply, I think, in oil and gas. Obviously, it's much easier to track in basketball because you can see it, right? And it's condensed and it's right in front of you. But in oil and gas, the focus on the margins too. If you can reduce your cost to drill a well, or for your cost to produce a barrel of oil, from $45 to $40, $5, it doesn't matter if you're only producing 1,000 barrels a day, 200 barrels a day. That $5 adds up, man.
No, it does. It's the inverse of say the Marcellus, and the Marcellus only works because the volumes are so big. It's really low margin per molecule, but the volumes are so big. If you're a PDP operator, you have a significant portion of your asset that you are a fiduciary for, or you're just trying to maintain it. You really have to pay attention to those margins. So Avenirre was created to help, not necessarily to say, what should I do? But really to answer the second question is does it make sense? And the does it make sense always has to have an economic outcome, right? It's got to be positive. And historically, to get to that answer, it would take a team of people and, some time period over a whole field to evaluate that. Now companies can do that in Avenirre every 5 minutes. And it's, you're absolutely right. So can you get the most out of your well? We're back to that efficiency question is how do you get the most out of your well? Secondly is, how do you eliminate siloing through redundant software platforms? How do you integrate more automated functionality into one platform so you rely less on people who are the most expensive part of production and maybe redundant software platforms? And one of the nice things is the company that I was a CEO of in East Texas was the beta customer for Avenirre. So every bit of Avenirre development was done as a differentiator tool for an upstream company. And then at some point I had to make the decision of which way I went. And I just felt like my passion, and Larry and I talked about this, was really around efficiency. How can we help other people break down those silos, see things they normally didn't see, and actually come out and win? How can they win in a situation where it just doesn't look winnable? And, we can prove it now over and over. And what's fun too is when you get customer data and you say, look, here's your bottom line cash flow is positive. But when you look at your top 13 wells that are losers, you're losing $68,000 a month on these. If you shut them in, your cash flow is going to go up, right? So it's counterintuitive thought process that is empowered by rapid analytics of your production data to give you visibility.
I love this stuff. I mean, you're talking my language right now, and I've told the story on this podcast before, but like I said, I've done 172 episodes. The odds are, if somebody heard it, they can just fast forward this, or they probably just didn't hear it. But the year was early 2015, and I was talking to, actually at the time, a prominent natural gas producer based in Dallas. And I was selling a dashboard. This was a dashboard. It wasn't in Spotfire. It wasn't in Tableau or Power BI. It was just a custom built HTML5 dashboard that had been implemented at another natural gas producer, an MLP at the time. And basically, this was a well profitability dashboard where they were taking accounting data, right? So actual accounting data from their ERP system, SAP or Inertia or Quorum or whatever it was. And they were taking their field estimate their field work data, right? So all of their daily report data and their costs associated with any job that was performed. Then they had their forecast coming from Aries, and they had their actual production coming from Merrick Pro Count or whatever their, ProdView or whatever their system was that did their production dailies, and also their invoices. So you could drill down to the invoice, right, for every field activity that was there. And you could go basically well by well, right, and look at the profitability of each well, like what you were talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And I think initially like IT, we sent out like an email or something, and IT caught on to this, and they said, hey, this is kind of something that our COO has been asking for. Let's bring him into the room. So they brought him into the room. This is over the web, mind you. So this was like a WebEx at the time, a GoToMeeting or whatever people used in 2015. And the COO, and I'm walking him through this, right? And I'm explaining it just sort of how I did to you, but then visually showing the product demonstration. And he goes, this is great. What's the cost? And I said, that for this, it's $50,000 a year. And he goes, hang on a second. And I think he meant to mute, but he didn't.
Uh-oh.
And he looked over at somebody on his team, or I envisioned him, and he goes, that's one well. Like if I can get efficiency and this insight into one well, and I optimize one well, shut in one well, or focus more attention on one well to increase production, open the choke, whatever it may be, this is worth it. So he came back and he goes, it's only 50,000. I go, I mean, I can charge you more if you're so desiring. I'm not sure if the street would like that, but he's like, all right, funny guy, just send me a proposal. So, got the deal, and it ultimately worked out well. Now the challenges, of course, came through the data, because the concept is the same as what you guys deal with. It's garbage in, garbage out. If the data at the source is still not trustworthy or consistent, nobody's going to care what the dashboard has to say, right? So yes, I love these conversations. You're definitely speaking my language. What are the types of analytics that you guys do? Do you have that level of like well profitability, visibility? Like what are the data types and the key points? And I know you're dying to just pull up your screen. You can't do that. Sorry, Casey. But tell me, like what are the things that you're pointing out that visibility into, so that companies can be more efficient?
Well, we do a lot of daily analytics on daily production, looking at pressure trends, production trends, but really how it impacts cash flow. So we have a company can load their own internal forecast, and then we have an auto decline that Larry created that essentially basically looks at it's a constantly evolving forecast that is looking at the differences between the company's forecast and actually what auto decline says. And what it does is it quantifies those volumes. We're pulling in real-time pricing to tell you, hey, you no longer have to go look and see where you spend your time. We do analytics on that. We also do your typical reserve analytics, cash flow analytics on where the opportunities are, where you're currently losing money. We do emissions analytics. We do monthly variances to forecast. So it's built to be, and our emissions analytics is very similarly to the platform. It's predicated on volumes, but it really is there to tell you what you're leaking in dollars, not volumes. So if you have some sort of repair estimate, you can look and see what the return is. Again, it comes back to what can I do versus what should I do? What makes sense? And everything that you do arguably should make economic sense.
What do you got for me, Larry? I know you got something.
Jeremy, many companies have not taken the next step and made their workflows more efficient. So for the first time in our lives, we have access to a large amount of storage capacity up on the web, up on the cloud, computing capacity that's become really cheap. But if they're still using the same workflows they always have, by having people do a lot of repetitive repetitive work every day in the workflows, there's really an improvement in efficiency there that can be pretty easily captured. And the idea is to throw those tedious workflows over to Avenirre, let that crunch the numbers in the middle of the night, and you come in the next morning, everybody in the company has access to the answer without waiting on someone to go get to their job and open up Excel or however they do their business and to calculate numbers. And so, anything that can be just purely numbers driven and has to do with oil and gas cash flow estimates, that's the part that we focus on and try to make that part easy for everybody.
Well, you're really tapping into my oil and gas nerd data part of my brain right now. I could easily go down this rabbit hole for a ways, but a couple of questions, right? So, Casey, you mentioned taking into account like NYMEX strip pricing, right? Which I think is obviously a good idea. And for whatever reason, it's not something I've seen a ton of. If you talk about like the true like data analytics or reporting dashboards in oil and gas, why I don't know. Do you also take into account if a company has hedges, right? So for their particular view and insight into the data, like a look at strip pricing versus their hedge versus the profitability, right? Because their hedge will dictate the profitability and the economics as well. Is that something you guys also pull in, or is that like a different ballpark?
No, it's not a different ballpark, but we just don't do it right now. Typically, Jeremy, every bit of our development since the beginning of this year has been something that's been requested by.
Yeah, right. Someone's got to ask you to do it.
Yeah, if somebody says, "Hey, we want to see," if somebody said, "Hey, we want to see," an NGL yield and then pricing pulled by Y grade barrel or individual stream, that's our job. We go do it. We, like Larry said, for the small to mid-sized companies, we become their back office IT. It's going to be a lot more cost effective for them to pick up something off the shelf like Avenirre as opposed to building it themselves.
No doubt. So are you a software company, or are you a services company, or is it a little bit of both?
It's probably 90% software. There's a little bit of services that some of our customers pay for to participate on calls, because Larry and I have a deep experience in operations. So it comes back to asking critical questions that sometimes somebody on the call is not wanting to ask because it's either their reputation, their job. So, Larry and I will participate on the calls and say, well, how did this happen? How did you get here? Does it make sense to do this? It's asking simple questions, but it's ultimately to get to the right answer.
Yeah, there could be risk for some people professionally asking what could be deemed as a question that they already should have answered to you guys that your software could solve. So I get it. And I think your answer makes plenty of sense. Should companies be asking to incorporate their hedge pricing? Yeah. Are they? No, they probably do something like that in a spreadsheet and take your data
because it's
out.
hard. Right. Because
Yeah.
it's hard. And you see a lot of that. People aren't doing things because they're hard. And like Larry said, with near infinite cloud capacity, and the way our platform works, our job then is to create those solutions. If somebody comes to us and says, "Hey, we want to have in your reserve dashboard, we want to have the ability to lock in a volume and a price on hedges and see how that impacts our cash flow." That's our job to go do that. And we do deployments every 2 weeks on new features. So that's, we have a pipeline of projects that we're always working on. And we've got developers that we pay, that are full time with us. So we do deployments every 2 weeks. That's entirely, Larry and I typically are going to know the problems, or we're going to understand the problem in order to go develop it on behalf of the customers. And the way our database works is, since it's cloud-based, is if one customer asks for it, all of our customers get the benefit of it.
Right. That's true SaaS, and that's the way it should be. So just reinforcing what you're going for here. I want to go way back in my career to the first tech sales job I ever had. When I first moved to Boulder, Colorado, 21 years ago, sight unseen, I didn't know really what I wanted to do. I wanted to make some money to at least pay for my rent and cell phone at the time. Maybe occasionally be able to afford to, go out to a brewery or something like that once a week, just make it through, eat enough food so that I could survive to the next paycheck. But I got a job at a company called Left Hand Networks, selling storage area networks that ran over IP. The primary competition at that point was Fiber Channel, which was really expensive. The affordable option at the time was storage area network that ran over IP. And for 1 terabyte of data storage, the cost was $20,000, and you had to buy an industrial fan to blow on the box to keep it cool. Now you look on your phone and a terabyte of data is like $2.99. So just to echo what you're saying, the ability and the access of cloud compute and cloud storage has made it easier to store mass amounts of data and do analysis on it quickly. So you're riding the right wave right now.
Yeah, one of the other things that I think you asked about earlier, maybe, is the architecture of Avenirre is deliberate in that it's what we call a microservices. So everything that we see in Avenirre, if there's updates in a service, we peel it apart, put it back together, and redeploy it. We're not rebuilding any of the architecture. It sits on a host framework, so that if there's new features and new products, new charting from some software company in California, we just plug it in, and then every customer gets a benefit. That way, we don't really, we don't accumulate this concept of technical debt. We're always on the architecture, on the code, on the, we use every bit of services we use is Microsoft Azure. And so, we're always staying up to date on cybersecurity, on performance, on storage, on all of the components of charting inside Avenirre.
Fantastic. Yep. It's good to pick a horse and ride it, right? I know there's a lot of AWS and oil and gas. There's a lot of Azure, right? A little bit less Google Cloud, but either way, these companies are going to need to figure out how to power their data centers, which is a whole other conversation that we can get into it at some point, but that time is probably not right now. On the emissions side of things, so I don't want to get too far away from that, because I feel like a lot of, at least Funk Future's client base and just a lot of what I see in the industry as far as emerging oil and gas tech is around both the sensor technology as well as the data, whether it be aggregation, analysis, or regulatory reporting around emissions. What does Avenirre do around emissions? Obviously, I know it ties in closely to production, especially as we're talking about natural gas or oil that also spits off gas. But you mentioned emissions. I don't want to get too far away from it. How does Avenirre deal with emissions?
So I'll take that one. There's two types of emissions, if you can broadly classify them as such, as fugitive and non-fugitive. Right. A fugitive emission is something that just kind of happens in life, is what it is. But it's the non-fugitive emissions is the one that Avenirre is focused on. And those are defined as emissions that you almost purposely emit as a way of doing your activities. All right, so imagine you've got a well and you've got a need to put chemical down the backside. Well, if there's no electricity at the location, what you do is you use a natural gas powered monkey pump, and it pumps. As is normal operation, it is designed to emit emissions, to emit methane. And so what we do is we go out to each location. We do an inventory, all the devices, the tanks, the liquid level controllers, whatever's out there. And I'll contact the manufacturer and we'll find out exactly how much they emit as a function of how they operate. And then then it becomes, now you're back in my wheelhouse. You're back to math at this point. So we can go through and take a look at their production and then figure out how much their emissions are. And because, as we mentioned earlier, we're downloading the WTI and NYMEX prices all live in real time. Yeah. I think we're 20-minute delayed, but we update them every 5 minutes. And so you've always got real-time pricing. So I've converted an emissions problem into a revenue problem, into a revenue question. How much are you emitting? What does it add up? And by inventorying your emissions like that, you're at the end of the month, you're ready to go. If you have any need for regulatory reporting, you've already got the volumes. But invariably, when you show the numbers, when people look at the numbers of how much money is being just vented, because it's kind of invisible, and we'll make it visible, then all of a sudden it becomes rather than everybody getting mad at each other, it's like, okay, well, what would it cost to fix this problem, and what would be our payout? And you start to begin to have constructive conversations about it. So that's what we find interesting about the way we do emissions.
Yep. Bring it back to the math. And I like that. I think that I want to see a little bit more of that. I know you guys kind of showed me a high level demo, but anyways, I'm going to shift the conversation a little bit here. I'm going to put you guys in the hot seat. Maybe you feel like you've been on the hot seat for the last 44 minutes anyway, but I'm putting you on right now. So for both of you, right, and this is something I ask all my guests, what advice would you give to your younger self, knowing what you know now? So the 21-year-old Larry Brazile, the 18-year-old Casey Patterson, you pick the age, the 24-year-old. What would you tell him?
Well, I would say always think like an owner of a company, even though you may be an employee. If you're constantly thinking from the perspective, if this was my company, if I owned this company, if I was actually having to, write the expense checks, if I was really having to think about things like that, I have found that helps me think more clearly over my whole career. Is how do I answer a question? Is like, okay, what really is the right answer? When you think about things just as an employee, sometimes you can kind of get off into some thought processes that kind of make sense to you, but don't make sense to the whole company. And so
That's right.
That'd be the biggest advice to my younger self.
I love that. Nobody's given that answer yet, but I think it's incredibly important from a career perspective. Ownership mindset versus employee mindset is very different. And I think especially at a entrepreneurial small company, whether you have equity or not, you have to think like an owner. And that can sometimes provide an internal challenge where you say, well, I don't actually own the company, so I don't really need to think like an owner. I can think in terms of self-preservation.
Right.
But ownership mindset is something I look for in my resources. And the ones that demonstrate that are the ones that ultimately do receive equity and ownership in the company. But it's not given, right? It's earned. And it's something that I've had to learn the hard way myself, where I thought I had an ownership mindset. But when you boiled it down to it, I had an employee mindset. How about you, Casey? What do you think?
Yeah, I would say I'd tell my younger self to be patient, be curious, be humble, and, and be willing to fail. I think particularly as a young professional, I was more focused on reputation and not wanting to fail. And I think that that I really wouldn't expand my boundaries only because you're risking failure. And I think that came to some expense of siloing myself. And I think if you're humble and you're willing to ask questions and say 10 minutes later than everybody else, looking at something that you saw and being a really good investigator, I think that's going to propel you to greatness 20 or 30 years. It's hard to see when you're young. I get it. But, if I was sitting here with myself, I'd say, look, just be humble, be okay with failing and learn how to pick up the pieces and move on and learn from it. Because if you don't fail, typically you're not going to learn.
Yeah. Yeah. Like you guys bring up, these are great thoughts. And I sort of wish, man, if I could just put my brain, or even better yet, Larry's brain, since it's got a few more years than mine, in somebody younger, so they don't have to learn by failure, right? Just so they can be a little bit more measured and have that level of patience and think like an owner. It would just save them so much headache and heartache in the short term and especially in the long term. But it's learned, right? Experience is the best teacher, and unfortunately, failure is what teaches us some of our greatest lessons.
Yep.
Right.
2 more hot seat questions, right?
Ooh.
What is your favorite restaurant in the DFW area?
So my wife and I, we particularly like a flavor of Mexican food that you find in New Mexico. And it's different than Tex-Mex, the Mexican food we have in Texas, which is largely flavored by the jalapeno. But in New Mexico, it's largely flavored by the chili. And it's really hard to find that here. We typically will like to go to Santa Fe because it's just full of good restaurants, that serve good chili Mexican food. But there's one here in Arlington, Texas, that we particularly like called La Benediction. And so it's when you drive up to it, it's kind of a hole in the wall. It doesn't look very good, but they have really good Mexican food. And so that's kind of my favorite. That's kind of our favorite. We hit that at least. We're empty nesters now, so we do a lot of eating out. So that's kind of on our regular rotation. It's on Fielder Road, and I'll give them a shout out for that.
La Benediction. Larry came out firing on that one, Casey. I hope you have something good.
Yeah, no chance there. Larry has we have a book of Larryisms here, and one of them that he always says I like is the only thing that his kitchen makes is reservations.
I like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, I would say my favorite restaurant is probably Silver Fox here in town, just right down the road from the office. I mean, it's
That's a
just
good one.
yeah, I've never had anything bad there. I mean, I consider myself a hamburger or a cheeseburger connoisseur,
Mm.
but when I want to take my wife out for something nice, we go to Silver Fox, and we've never been let down. It's always impressively good.
Love it. Love it. And Larry, before I forget, if you're ever in Denver, I'll take you to La Loma. La Loma has the best green chili that I've ever had. You know, Colorado gets some of that New Mexico influence in its food as well. A little bit of the Tex-Mex from Texas. But because I get that sort of New Mexican green chili centric uh, New Mexican food, when I go to Texas, I like to get the Tex-Mex.
Yeah, yeah.
Final question. What does Avenirre look like in 3 years, 5 years? 10 years. This is like $100 million company. Is this somebody that you're focused on going up market to bigger operators? Do you want to stay kind of lean and mean? Do you want to spread your products into different areas? I don't want to put the answers in your mouths, but what does this company look like in 3 to 5 years?
Well, I'll go first. It looks different, very different than it does now, and I think that I know that there's a long-term development plan on the horizon. I believe that oil and gas operators are going to continue to have pressure to kind of maybe arbitrage their product or re-diversify their revenue mix, either in from oil and gas into Bitcoin. So, what does it look like? It looks like a solution that tells you, does it make sense to put a Bitcoin miner here? Can you imagine an oil and gas screen that shows declining production with increasing renewable electricity along with an electricity strip?
I
So
like that.
I look at it as becoming kind of an energy management tool, an oil and gas energy management tool as we diversify as a society, into a larger percentage of renewables as we grow. So I see, with continued growth becoming a very, very big private company. I don't see us going public. I see us being a very large private company through acquisition and also through further development of additional products that we already have identified.
Yeah, that's something that Casey and I talk about on a regular basis, especially toward the end of the year, and you're making plans for 2025. And so, our vision is exactly the same. So Casey said it very well.
Yeah, and
I
I'd
think
say,
go ahead, Casey.
but I also think that what makes Larry and I founders and very good product identifiers and product developers is probably not what makes us the best to really explode the total market for Avenirre. And so in 5 years, I would say the executive leadership will still be involved, but the executive leadership is probably going to be somebody else who's younger, who understands marketing and sales better than we do.
Eric Haig. No, I'm just kidding. That's their sales guy. Shout out Eric Haig. I worked with them for
Our first sales guy that we hired 6 weeks ago. Yeah.
Well, congratulations on that. That is a big step, and that's a very important hire. I've placed a lot of those resources. I've been that resource, right? I've succeeded and failed as that person, so I get it. This is really fun, guys. I think you're onto some good stuff. I think you guys are bright. I think you've got the requisite drive to make the company whatever you want to make it. And I also think that I let you off the hook a little bit here. That's a much easier question to answer on December 30th than it is on July 30th, June 30th, when you're like in the middle of the grind, right? Like this actually is the time of year where you can reflect and place a little bit of focus on strategy versus just living and surviving in the tactical. So I wish I had a harder question on that, but you guys were too smooth with it. Where can people find both of you, and where can they find your company?
I think the number one place is Avenirre.com, Avenirre.com. There's information about Avenirre there, our products, our solutions, our customers, a little bit of history about Larry and myself individually, and then any sort of a contact or demo request information that anybody wants to see.
Avenirre.com, Avenirre.
Nirre.
Avenirre.
Avenirre.com.
Sorry,
So,
Avenirre.com. Sorry, I
yes, sir.
butchered that.
That's all right.
2
Let me
R's,
tell you
1 N.
why. It'd be interesting to hear where this name came from. We were trying to come up with a single word to describe our company, and we went through everything in English, everything in Spanish. All the words were taken 50 years ago, and so it's for the first time I actually understood why Google named their search engine something like Google, because they needed a word that no one ever used before, so they could copyright it. So I began to look at other languages and noticed that there was a word in French called Avenir, which means the future. And I thought, well,
nice.
that's exactly what we're trying to create, is the future way of running an oil and gas operating company. So that kind of stuck. The spelling is a little different. I get that.
It may be French, but you're speaking my language, because I just took my last name and slapped future.
Yeah. Oh, wow.
Futures on the end of it. So not too dissimilar, but I hope the future is bright for you guys. Happy New Year. And thanks for coming on What the Funk.
Okay.
Thank you for your time.